The Canon C70 was released, or at least announced, yesterday, and the specs look pretty exciting. It can do 4K video at 120 FPS, and it's using the same sensor as the Canon C300 Mark III, so no full frame, it's a Super 35 sensor, but it has up to 16 stops, or according to Canon's website, at least 16 stops of dynamic range. And this is because it's using the dual gain ISO setting that the Canon C300 Mark III had, so that combined with C-Log 2 gets you honestly an insane amount of dynamic range and pretty good low light sensitivity and very clean images too. And if 120 FPS isn't fast enough or slow enough for you, then you can drop down to 2K and get 180 FPS. And if you're fed up of very compressed files, this camera can record in 10-bit 422 in XFAVC and MP4 files. And it's also insanely practical. It has 2 SD card slots and it takes the Canon BP batteries that the rest of the cinema lineup take. The input and output is very nice too. It has timecode in, which is good because my C100 Mark II doesn't have that, and I honestly kind of wish it did. And the C70 also has a full-size HDMI output. None of the mini HDMI outs that wobble and fall out whenever you look at the camera. No, a full-size proper HDMI port. It has the new autofocus system and the features that you've seen in the Canon R5, but unlike the R5, the C70 has active cooling via a fan, and apparently it's all sealed in, so dust and a bit of moisture won't get in and damage any of the electronics, so that's nice. And because of the active cooling, the C70 should have no overheating problems whatsoever. And just before we get on to the most exciting specification of the Canon C70, I should also say that it does have 2 mini Xlr ports, so that's good if you want phantom power and professional audio. And it also has, I believe, 13 assignable buttons, which is quite impressive considering how small the camera was. I was worried that it wasn't going to have anywhere near the number of assignable buttons as the C100 Mark II because of how much smaller it is, but apparently Canon has found a place to put all of these assignable buttons. But this brings me on to the most exciting thing about the Canon C70, and that is the lens mount. The C70 is the first Canon cinema camera with an RF lens mount, so that means the RF 2870 f2 and the C70, you see where I'm going, that could be a pretty cool combo. And actually what's even more impressive than the RF mount is that the C70 has built-in ND filters, up to 10 stops. And honestly, I'm impressed at how small the ND system is that Canon's had to come up with, because there's really not a lot of room with an RF mount sized flange distance. So the fact that Canon has managed to squeeze in a full up to 10 stops of ND filter in such a small space is very impressive. And along with the RF mount, Canon has announced that they will be making their own speed booster. So if you don't want to use RF lenses and you just want to stick with EF lenses, you can attach the 0.71 times speed booster, which converts from EF mount to RF mount. You actually screw that into the body of the C70, and then you get effectively a full frame field of view. So it's not technically a full frame camera, but with the speed booster option and EF lenses, it is effectively a full frame cinema camera. So the Canon C70 looks like an amazing camera. It looks like Canon has crushed all competition. So, am I gonna buy one? No. At least, definitely not with its current list of specs, because here's my problem. The Canon C70 can't shoot RAW. If the camera was £3,000, £3,500, I would understand this, because it would be positioned as a replacement to the C100 Mark II. But that's not the price of the C70. There isn't actually a UK price, but looking at some American websites, I imagine the C70 is going to cost around £5,500. That's the same price as a C200, which, okay, it has one less stop of dynamic range, it doesn't have an RF mount, and it doesn't have the same slow motion features, but you are getting RAW, and RAW is a very useful thing to have with a cinema camera. £5,500 also means that the Canon C70 is only about £500 cheaper than the red Komodo. And that's a pretty difficult sell. Now, admittedly, the Red Komodo is going to need 1,000 or even 2,000 pounds worth of accessories to bring it up to the same level of usability as the Canon C70, but even so, the Red, it's even smaller, so potentially easier to rig up. It has a global shutter, so it's going to handle motion even better. It's Red, so the color science is going to be excellent, and just being able to say you own a Red, I mean, it sounds kind of stupid, but you can potentially get yourself more jobs just by saying I own a Red, because people do respect, or at least they like the sound of a Red camera being used on their shoots. So this brings me on to a rather interesting point, and that is, who is the Canon C70 for? Because I can see a very ideal target market for the camera. Because of the screw mount that it has on the hand grip, you can mount the C70, or you can very easily mount it vertical for shooting vertical video, which, whilst as a filmmaker I kind of hate it, that is useful if you're going to be making content that's seen on a phone, such as Instagram video or perhaps even TikTok video. So for people doing a lot of video for social media, for like marketing companies, and the most important thing is they can just crank out the content every day and not have to deal with a raw workflow. Yeah, the C70 makes sense, and having 16 stops of dynamic range, I will admit that does negate some of the need for RAW, because with 16 stops you're very unlikely to blow out the sky unless you horrifically mess up the exposure, and that's one of the benefits of RAW, having the highlight recovery. And I know that was one of the use cases of cameras like the Sony FS7 Mark II and the FS5. They were very popular for sort of social media marketing companies, so I could see some of them going for a Canon C70. But that seems to be a bit of a niche user case, because if you're just starting out as a filmmaker and you want a really inexpensive cinema camera, the Blackmagic cameras offer much better value for money, and if you're like me, you're looking to upgrade from a camera that's around $3,000 to something that's a bit better, it's got better specs than what you were using before, and you want RAW because you're doing cinema style, very cinematic content, well, if you want a Canon cinema camera, you're probably going to buy a C200, and if you don't want a Canon cinema camera, the new Sony FX6 that's not actually been announced, but judging by the rumours, that's going to be a full-frame 6K camera, a lot of the same specs as the FX9, so that's going to be incredible. And even the Red Komodo, I mean, that has an RF mount, so it's going to work with all your Canon lenses, and it really looks like an incredible little camera. So I'm not sure how wide the Canon C70's target market is. My main problem is that it's just too expensive for a camera that doesn't shoot RAW. And it's really annoying, because if it shot RAW, I would probably buy one. With the added practicality and being a bit cheaper, I reckon I would take a C70 over a Red Komodo. But just with the lack of RAW, it's hard to justify it, and it's also hard to justify the lack of RAW as a technical limitation of the C70's design. I mean, even the R5 can shoot 8K RAW. Sure, it overheats, but 8K RAW from a tiny little mirrorless camera, yet the C70 with active cooling can't do RAW. To me, that seems like a move to protect the C300 Mark III rather than a hardware limitation. So there we go, my thoughts on the Canon C70 and whether or not I will be buying one, which I won't unless they add RAW. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing so as not to miss any new videos. See you later.